I seriously believe people have profoundly misunderstood metamorphoses. For years, I have seen the same interpretations repeated over and over again. It's about capitalism, it's about Marxism, it's about parental abuse, it's about toxic masculinity and patriarchy. And whilst some of these interpretations are valid and make sense, you guys are missing something that is much more on the nose and much more devastating. And honestly, I would say much more human. Because at its core, Metamorphosis is one of the most realistic and painful portrayals of what it feels like to lose your body. Suddenly, one day you wake up and you have no control over your body. You cannot function the way you used to. Your independence is gone, and suddenly your whole identity has disappeared. It almost seems as if suddenly your entire worth is questioned because your body can no longer perform, which is exactly what happens to the main character of Metamorphosis. Hello, my gorgeous viewers and readers. Welcome back and welcome if you're new. I hope your weekend was filled with cold drinks, sunny terraces, and the sudden terrifying feeling that your body is actually much more fragile than you think. Because today, I want to talk about one of the works that has been most discussed in the past 100 years, which is Metamorphosis by Kafka. And let me tell you, many of these interpretations are incredibly valuable because some of them talk about labor, about alienation, about loneliness, but most importantly, they talk about how painful it is to be human sometimes. Just as a quick summary, Metamorphosis follows Gregor, a traveling salesman and who is also the sole provider of his family, who one day wakes up and suddenly discovers that he has been turned into a giant insect. Immediately, his entire life collapses. He cannot work, he cannot properly communicate with others, or he cannot walk around the house. He really struggles with movement, but most importantly, he becomes trapped in his own home. From the get-go, we see that Gregor is actually more worried about not being able to work and disappointing his boss than actually looking like a giant insect, which already shows us that he ties his own worth to his productivity, which makes sense because he is the sole financial provider of the family. But the more the story advances, the more we realize that all these worries suddenly disappear when he realizes that he cannot communicate with his family. He cannot speak with his parents nor with his sister. At first, all the members of the family are terrified about this creature, but once they realize that this creature is actually Gregor, obviously they take the matter into their own hands and they try to take care of the creature or of Gregor as much as they can, especially his sister. She is constantly trying to help in any way, shape or form. So she brings him food, she tries to make him more comfortable in the room that he is in. But the more time passes by, the more we realize that these relationships are suddenly eroding. But the more his condition worsens, the more Gregor becomes a financial strain, a burden, an inconvenience, or an object of shame. Suddenly, Gregor is not a son or he is not a sibling. He is something that has to be hidden. His room becomes his own prison. Suddenly, his parents or his family don't want to communicate with him anymore. They don't want him to be included because having him in the house or having him exist is deeply shameful. Before I continue, I want to make something very clear. When I discuss Gregor's transformation into a giant bug as an allegory for disabilities or chronic illnesses or neurodivergences, I am not saying that people with disabilities are less than able-bodied people or that they are monstrous or that they are comparable to insects. That is not what I'm saying. That is not my argument. What I am trying to examine here is how Kafka's use of radical bodily transformation is actually deeply relatable to the social realities that many people with disabilities face even nowadays. For example, the loss of autonomy and independence, the social exclusion, the caregiver strain, the stigma, but most importantly, the changing identity of people with disabilities. As someone who is neurodivergent myself and who has very close relationships with people who have both physical and mental disabilities, I cannot stop myself but reading this book in a different lens. Let me show you what are the things that made me think this book is about disabilities and not about capitalism or patriarchy or any of the things that many people are talking about. Now, follow my train of thought here. What makes Gregor's transformation so horrifying is not that he turns into a bug. It's that when he wakes up, he suddenly realizes that the body that he is now in doesn't work in a way that is either productive, that is either normal, or that is even human. So suddenly he wakes up in a body that he cannot control, that he cannot move, and that he cannot communicate with others. He is absolutely isolated. That's what makes Kafka's writing so absurdist, but also at the same time, it makes it so terrifying because Gregor has no way to communicate all the thoughts that he has, but also he cannot be the person that he once was. His experience perfectly mirrors the devastating reality many people face when they acquire a disability, either by chronic illnesses, by neurodivergence, or by severe injury. One day your body is working as it used to, the next day it doesn't. Suddenly your limbs don't work as they should, or your brain doesn't process information as it used to, or suddenly you have lost all your independence because you can do the tasks that you considered mundane ones. But perhaps what is most painful is how the perception people have of you changes. Suddenly, you are not yourself anymore. You are not the identity that you once had. You are something else. You are yourself, but with a disability. And according to research, this is one of the things people who were once able-bodied and now are disabled struggle the most with. And this is exactly what we see in Gregor's transformation. We don't see him asking himself what happened or why am I like this. He asks himself instead, how will I work? How will I provide? Or what will people think of me? Which is very telling because Gregor, just like many people in our reality, find themselves that their identity is extremely and very keeply tied with their own productivity and their own functions. If they are not useful, they are not themselves. So when Gregor's body can no longer work as it used to or as he wants to, he quickly spirals into shame, into isolation, into loneliness, but also most importantly into depression. When we look at the research of people who were once able-bodied and suddenly acquire a disability, we see something extremely similar. So according to the data or according to the research that I've done, people who suddenly acquire disabilities consistently show increased rates of things like depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation, or social withdrawal and isolation. Most importantly, body dysmorphia. That is something that I've seen a lot, especially with physical disabilities. And then obviously grief responses that are very similar to actual mourning. Which makes a lot of sense because what you are actually doing is grieving your body. You're grieving the identity that you once had, which is exactly what we see in Gregor. We see how he suddenly does an 180 and accepts the role that he has been put into, which is the role of monster, the role of insect, and the role of being useless and just being a burden, which is exactly what we see in some cases of people with disabilities or people who suddenly acquire a disability. No, I'm not saying that they are burdens. I'm saying that that is how they feel once they acquire the disability themselves. Which to me makes a lot of sense, because even though socially we oftentimes say that we value diversity or inclusion and that we prioritize making sure that everyone feels welcomed and accepted, in reality, we view people with disabilities as inconveniences, as burdens. We treat them as something that has to be done just for optics and for metrics, rather than actual inclusion and diversity. And to me, this is the reason why this book suddenly moves from a personal tragedy to a systemic critique, because Gregor's transformation is not the only thing that destroys him. It is the fact that everything around him refuses to change for him. That is the thing that actually isolates him, exhausts him, and also makes him think like he's the problem, because no one in his surroundings is actually understanding of him. They just treat him as an inconvenience and as something that has to be dealt with. Because all along the book, we see that there is actually no meaningful adaptation around him. His house becomes hostile. He cannot move around the house freely, but also he has no space where he can be himself. He's constantly judged, especially by his dad. And also, even when he is trying to communicate, there is no meaningful effort from the other side to actually try to understand him. He is constantly put at odds, and he is vilified, because he is, even though he is vulnerable, he is not independent, and he is also treated as he is a burden. Which is exactly how society handles disability. Because instead of creating a system that is truly inclusive and diverse, we actually isolate the disabled individual and expect him to adapt alone. And this is something that we see every day in society, more specifically with things like employment or housing or even social third spaces. I cannot even begin to tell you how exclusionary workplaces are still nowadays, even under disability protections. Like, if we look into the data, we see how disabled individuals are constantly facing hiring discrimination, even according to DEI and protection laws, how there's a lot of inaccessible offices that people with disabilities, physical disabilities, cannot get into, or there's always reduced accommodations, or people think of accommodations as something, as a burden to take into account, or how even people with disabilities have wage disparities. There's so many things. There are so many situations that we see in the workforce that actively exclude people with disabilities. Another thing that I see that is very obvious to me is how little prepared houses are for people with disabilities, not only in the UK or in Spain, but in general as a norm in every country. Like, things with stairs, for example, or lack of lifts, or narrow hallways, or door frames. These are things that we need to take into account, but what the people that are able-bodied usually don't need to take into account, but those are things that actually severely affect people with disabilities. The best example that I have for this is my grandmother. So she died in her 70s, around almost 10 years ago now, so it doesn't affect me anymore. And also, I had a weird relationship with her, but she was an almost perfectly healthy woman in her 60s when she got run over by a car and spent, I think it was around 5 to 6 months in ICU, but she survived barely. And the one thing that she really struggled with after this terrible accident was that she was physically disabled after she left the ICU. She could barely move her hand. She could not move her shoulders. She was paralyzed from the left side, if I remember correctly. But yeah, after spending so much time in the ICU, when she went back home to the house that she had lived for 40 years and that she had built herself with her husband, with my granddad, she realized that she could not live in that house anymore, because everything that she had built, everything that she liked and that she had carefully chosen, she could no longer live with that, right? So there were a lot of stairs in that house. There were ramps that were very wonky, and there were things that she could not overcome with this disability. So obviously she was distraught because the house that she had called hers for 40 years was no longer the house that she could inhabit. So obviously this loss is not only practical, but it's emotional, because that house was her safe space. That was her castle. And she realized that the life that she was meant to have, or the life that she was having before the accident, that was no longer her life. She had to change everything around the house. She had to put a lift. She had to change the ramps. She had to do so much work just so she was able to live in that house. Now, another thing that is painfully real from this book is the pressure of caretaking, because even though Gregor, he is not the villain, and he is not the one who actually wanted this life and wanted this transformation, or that could control this transformation. The pressure that the parents and the sister have in order to take care of Gregor and to make sure that he is safe, that he is fed, and that he is accounted for is insane. That is something that many people who live with people with disabilities, or who are their caretakers, often talk about. Because caretaking is always physically, emotionally, and financially very incredibly demanding, but it is also exhausting. It's something that can burn you inside, and that can also create resentment, which is exactly what we see in the book. Because at first, the family is very happy to help, right? Especially the sister. She is happy to help and to support Gregor and to make sure that he is taken care of. But the more time goes by, and the more the financial strain becomes apparent, because he is the only one, or he was the only one who was the financial provider, the more we see this resentment, which is something that happens very often in real life as well. In real life, families often struggle with all these emotions and all these feelings, especially because of the caretaking. Not only they have this financial strain of having to suddenly change everything around the house, or having to bring someone to help with the caretaking, but also all these feelings of resentment, burnt out, guilt, and all these negative feelings that you have against the injured person or the disabled person are very real. That is not something that we can hide, but also that is not something that should make you resent the disabled person themselves, because at the end of the day, usually, very oftentimes, this situation is not their fault either. Gregor's suffering is not only caused by his physical transformation, but by stigma, exclusion, caregiver burnout, financial pressures, but most importantly, by conditional love. Which is exactly why I think that Metamorphosis by Kafka is about an able-bodied man suddenly becoming disabled, because it perfectly captures how your entire worth and your identity suddenly disappears when you are not productive, when you are not the person that you used to be, when this identity that defined you suddenly is not the identity that you are now. Because underneath all the surrealism, he understood something terrifyingly real, and it's that humanity's biggest fear is not only of suffering, but also of becoming so inconvenient that you become forgotten. That's all for today, guys. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed this interpretation of Metamorphosis by Kafka. If you have read the book, I would love to know your opinion about it. So please make sure that you put down in the comments what you think of the story, or what you thought of my interpretation, or any other interpretations that you have read. And if you want more content about Metamorphosis or any other books on this matter, please make sure that you follow me on my social media. I post that every day, and I post different content, so please make sure that you don't miss out. But yeah, that's all for today. Thank you so much for watching, guys. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I will see you soon. Bye.